Has everybody seen my main screen here of the two stream pictures? All right. I'm going to present some data today. I think a lot of people are familiar with the sampling we do with Chester County. It's in cooperation with the Water Resources Authority, and we've been collecting stream quality samples since around 1970. So we have a really long database. Today, I'm going to kind of keep the talk focused on chloride and the chemical sampling we do, but to let you know that we collect invertebrates as part of the biological monitoring program every October, November, early December. And again, this is a program that's been going on since the early 70s. For today, I'm going to focus, I think John Jackson is going to focus on some more of the biological aspect of the chloride. I'm going to focus more on the chemistry that we collect. We have 27 sites that we collect a year. 18 of them are at fixed sites, so we have 1 point a year. These are composite water samples, so we collect at various parts across the stream, composite the samples, and every year we run an analysis for the same constituents. That way we have a nice long database of the same constituents. All of our samples go to our national lab in Denver and have since the beginning of the program. So it's a very consistent collection, very consistent analytical technique. So we have a very solid database on this issue. One thing important with the data I'm going to present, especially the data from the Chester County sampling that we do, all the samples are collected in the October, November timeframe. They're all base flow samples, no storm flow. This is all at low flow conditions. Pretty much it represents a groundwater discharge to the stream. So we avoid any rain events, any snow events, anything that's going on. In the October, November timeframe, we are as far away from salting events as you can get. We're right before the winter season starts. So there's no road salts running into the stream for these samples. So these are all background stream conditions unrelated to any storms, any winter sampling. This graph just shows some various constituents that we do. And I put this up here just to show what kind of the normal pattern in our data looks like. And you can see whether it's potassium or nitrate. We can see year-to-year differences. Again, these data are not flow corrected. However, they are all within a very limited flow pattern, being the low flow sample. So there's not a lot of flow variation at these sites. But you see some ups and downs through the years. There might be a general increase over time, but it generally is a slow increase year over year. There's variation between years, some ups, some downs. So that's kind of a normal pattern of what we see for a lot of the constituents. We tend not to see huge jumps year to year. It's more of a continual slow change, positive or negative. And a lot of sites have little change that go on. However, when we bring up chloride concentrations, we see kind of a different pattern, a much steeper line, a much steeper increase over time. And these are two examples, Valley Creek near Valley Forge and East Branch Chester Creek at Westtown. These are both fairly urbanized areas. They have a lot of roads in their basin. They get a lot of salting in the winter. And you can see at Valley Creek, this is starting in 1998. We have data at some of these that go back, and the trend kind of goes back in time. Notice that the concentrations here, Valley Creek started out in 98, a little bit below 60. It's now running up near 120 to 140. So that's, quite a steep increase that we've seen over time. East Branch Chester Creek, same pattern, starting at around 40. It's up now around 130, 140. So these are dramatic increases that we haven't seen in other parameters. Another thing to note is in a lot of the data, somewhere around 2012, 2013, there seems to be even steeper increase in that line. And this is a pattern that shows up in a lot of sites that we have. In fact, almost all the sites, it seemed to be that sharp increase around 2013. If we look at sites that are in less urban areas, that have less road networks, we still see an increase in the chloride. It's just that the concentrations are lower and the increase is less. So we're seeing concentrations. This is Big Elk Creek near Maple Grove. And we're seeing around 20 up to maybe about 35. So it's a significant increase, but it's not the increase that we've seen in more urban sites. Octorara Creek, same situation where we're seeing a definite increase from maybe in the 17, 18 range up to around 25. But we're not seeing that sharp spike. But also, if you notice in these around 2013, 2014, that line seems to get steeper. Seems to be something that happened around then that's increasing the chloride concentrations. At some sites that are a little bit mixed, West Branch Brandywine, East Branch Brandywine, they tend to start headwaters in agricultural forested areas, then run through urban centers. Again, the pattern's the same, where we're seeing chlorides increase from the 2030 range up to the 50-60 range. So this has been consistent at every site that we have long-term data in. There's been an increase. The more urban, the more roads in the network, the faster and the bigger the increase is. Just for some background, this is a graph of Baptism Creek, which is up in French Creek State Park. Very few roads cross the stream. There's very little inputs, and we're getting background chloride concentration in the 2 to 3 range. Now, chloride can change based on geology, based on inputs, but most of the streams we have are starting out in at least the 20 to 30 range, which is well above probably the natural background for these streams. And many of them are now approaching 60 to 80 milligrams per liter of chloride, which is significantly higher than they've ever been. Looking at some data from 98 to 2009 from an old report we had, there's a definite sharp relationship between the percent of urban land use and dissolved chloride concentrations. Obviously, the more urban land use we have, the more chloride we're getting, a very strong relationship there. This is a graph that Chester County put together with our data, and it just shows that same pattern. This is results from the 2018 sampling that we did. And you can see that the highest values we have are in the more urban areas. So the Delaware Basin, kind of along the Route 3 corridor, heavy urbanization, lots of corporate centers, lots of shopping centers, parking lots, roads. We get higher chlorides. Valley Creek, even French Creek or Pickering Creek in Phoenixville, after it's picking up a lot more. You see our lowest values, the headwaters of the Brandywine, Pigeon Creeks, areas that have a less dense road network. So there's a different relationship between the urban environment and the amount of chloride we're getting in the samples. You can see even down at Red Clay, we're getting up in the 60-80 range, where upstream of there, we're in the 30s. These are a couple sites that we have that long-term data we've been collecting since the 70s. And you can see back in the early 70s, we were down in the 10-20 range. French Creek's on the bottom here, and you can see a very slow rise. It has risen, but kind of not as sharply, where the more urbanized basins of Valley Creek and East Branch Chester Creek, there was a slow rise up into the 90s. And then as we hit 98, that rise seems to increase. And then when we get to that 2013, 2012 time, it's gotten even higher. So for some of these sites, they were down maybe 25 in the early 70s, and they're now running up near 150. So that is a very significant rise for a constituent over time. I mentioned before that these are stream water samples that are mostly groundwater oriented. I did pull some data on some groundwater wells we have and found 2 examples. We don't have quite the long-term data, a lot of these groundwater wells, a lot of point samples over time. But one well, CH1567, was a well that NACWA had sampled. So there were multiple samples from 1999 to 2019, actually 2021. And you see the same pattern. Started out in the 40s, raised up to around 60, and then in that, somewhere in this, now we don't have quite as many points in here, but somewhere between 2013 and 2021, a very large increase in groundwater. Well, at CH10, now we don't have the long-term This one is part of the Pennsylvania groundwater network we're running, and it's going to be sampled every year. It just started in 2018, but you can see for those couple of years, there's been no change really. And this one is a much more rural area down near Doe Run, not as many roads, a lot of pasture land, so we're not seeing quite the influence. So it's definitely, the groundwater is also being inundated with salt at this point. One thing we do keep track of, we have a lot of gauges that have specific conductance real-time being measured. This is a graph from Modena on the West Branch of the Brandywine. And the general pattern is in the summer, spring, and fall, when we get rain, generally as discharge goes up, you'll see conductance go down as that fresh rainwater washes in. It's low in conductance and the conductance will drop. However, in the winter, when there's salting events, we see the opposite of that. And what these peaks represent are, these are salting events in the winter. This was last February. And you're seeing spikes in conductance going from around 420 up to over 1,000 several times. So these are events when there's salt water running into the streams off of the roads, and you can see these peaks. We collected some samples this fall, and we have a monitor running at Cobbs Creek in Philadelphia. So this is a very, very heavy urbanized area right in the middle of Philadelphia. And we're seeing conductance peaks that are going up over 6,000, 4,000 regularly in the winter when there's runoff events. So these are very high concentration events that are hitting the streams. You can see after the event, we're back down. It normally runs 600 or 700. So these events are short term, but they're very high concentrations of chloride. We did collect some actual chloride samples to go with some of these samples also last winter. So give you an idea, in Frankfort Creek in Philadelphia, several different storms of different magnitudes, but we got somewhere between chloride milligrams per liter of 130 and over 1,000 milligrams per liter in one sample. Darby Creek, same storms, we got between around 100 and 650. So these are very high concentrated events. They may be short-lived, but they do happen every time there's a salting. One thing we're working on with Chester County too is that we have several sites, the Brandywine at Chadds Ford, Valley Creek near Valley Forge, and White Clay Creek, where we're going to be producing conductance chloride surrogate models. So it will give you kind of a real-time chloride value as long as the conductance monitor is running. So they will be coming out shortly and will be available on our website. It'll be a way to get kind of real-time chloride information for those sites. Just to let you know, this is a graph from some Wisconsin USGS data. This is not a problem that's unique to southeastern Pennsylvania. This is a problem that has been seen across all the areas in the country that receive salt in the winter. Data here, you can see the same pattern where this is showing summer, spring, winter, and fall. The winter is obviously higher, but you can see theirs happened around 1995. There seemed to be this rise in chloride that happened in the winter, all seasons. So that seems to be a pattern that we've seen more like 2012, 2013. Looks like Wisconsin was seeing it maybe a good 10 years earlier than that. So just a quick summary is the chloride concentrations have gone up 2 to 3 times since 1998. So it's a significant high rise. And keep in mind that these rises have occurred at this was data that was in the fall. So this is not related to direct storms. This is groundwater input that is slowly released through the year. And the higher chloride concentrations are associated with higher urbanization in the watershed. The more roads you have, the more parking lots you have, the more chloride we're getting in the streams. Now that rate of chloride increase can't be explained simply by there being more roads, because the amount of road increase and parking lot increases has not doubled or tripled in the last 20 years. So there seems to be either a buildup in the baseline concentrations or some kind of increase in salting or number of events. Something has changed that's causing those chlorides to increase quicker. It may be that the groundwater is just becoming saturated. More and more salt is going into the groundwater. Base flow samples are below the EPA chronic water criteria of 230. but storm concentrations can easily, as you see, exceed that multiple times throughout the winter. We're going to be trying to operate as many conductance monitors as we can through the winter and trying to develop as many of these chloride to conductance surrogate models and try to keep them running so we get some idea of what the maximum chloride concentrations in the winter are. So that's what we're working on now. If we have any questions, I guess we can hold them until John presents his maybe. Brian, I think that might be the best.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. And if you want to save them in the chat, that's a good place to put them as a holding place, or we'll open up the microphone. So thank you, Drew. Very thorough. Appreciate your work on pulling all that data together and some of the newer information. So now we'll switch to John Jackson with Stroud Water Research Center. John, go ahead and share the screen. Thank you for your time, John, putting your presentation together. John, we're seeing a portion of your screen. You're also muted. It's about a fifth of this. There we go. That's good. So if you're just joining us, saw a few people sign in. This is a second presentation with John Jackson. Drew Reif just presented his data. We are recording this meeting, so it will be available on our CWMP YouTube site. If you missed Drew's presentation, you can see that.
Gosh, I'm trying to turn presenter view off. I'm open to suggestions. How do I turn presenter view off?
Yeah.
What I see.
You're seeing all that?
Yeah.
All right, so that's it's messing around with.
Oh. Funny, it looks like when you close out of it, we get a full screen for a flash second and then it's gone.
All right. How about we try this? How's that look for you, Brian?
Looks good, John.
So,
Looks good.
title of my presentation today is both optimistic and pessimistic, because as Drew just showed you, we have salt everywhere. And the real question is, does it matter? And where and when and why? So there's gonna be a lot of information, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna go fast, but there's a range of things you need to think about. So here's my take-home messages. We'll start with them. This is a contaminant at this point. Road salt, sodium chloride is appearing in our waterways at such a level we have to be concerned. And it's not one that's tightly regulated yet. This was not an issue when the Clean Water Act was passed. It wasn't an issue like Drew showed you in 1970 or 1980, but it is one now. And the states and the regulators are struggling to catch up. Salt toxicity based on bioassays depends on the type of stream, the duration of the exposure, the water temperature. All important issues, as you saw in Drew's presentation. The increase in salt use reflects concerns about safety, the economics of winter storms, and then societal and political concerns and priorities. This is not something that happened. It's something we asked for and we pay for. And finally, there's now increased concern about salt use, but the increase itself didn't really pay attention to the health issues, the infrastructure issues, or even the environmental impacts. And so the conversation is changing now as the issue becomes a bit more of a hot topic. So when we call it an emerging contaminant, or a contaminant of emerging concern, it just means we need more information. And quite often we hear it referred to for pharmaceuticals in our water, personal care products, antibiotics, steroids, bactericides, pesticides, and lately PFAS, the forever chemicals. These are things that you hear a lot about as being a contaminant of concern. But there's lots of roadway pollutants that we're starting to pay attention to, whether it's de-icing salts or PAHs and seal coats, or most recently, a tire chemical that's found to be quite toxic to salmonids. This is a relatively new thing. We know that urban streams struggle to be healthy, and one of the reasons is probably these emerging pollutants. We just don't know much about them. But we do know a fair bit about salt. We live salty lives, and therefore we know a fair bit about what we're using and where we're using it and how we're using it. And one way we're using it is in road salt. So this is a graph for the United States that shows road salt use beginning in 1940. This graph ends in 2005. You see a gradual increase leveling off around the 70s and staying consistent until the mid-90s, and then these giant spikes in the mid-90s. Now we're at 23 or 24 million metric tons of salt per year, road salt use in the United States. So we've gone up again, and this pattern parallels the data that Drew just showed you. The spike here, and now another spike up. But what it means is our regulations, which came into effect, say, in the early 70s, weren't looking at a problem because the water that we were sampling was water that, for example, went into the ground 20, 30, 40 years earlier. Now we're sampling water that's receiving a lot more salt and has for decades. The concern, or the first paper I'm aware of, is actually from the Philadelphia area. And this was done from the water intake data for Philadelphia out of the Schuylkill. And these are the data, they published it in 2003, but it looked at data from 77 to 1999, and chloride doubled and sodium chloride, or sodium doubled in that time period. And this was the first, for me as a scientist, the first red flag that we have salt problems. Since then, numerous papers have been published. You can now produce a map for the entire nation where these red areas are areas where salt has increased dramatically. All of the yellow areas are areas where salt has increased measurably. Much of this is due to road salt, but not all of it. In some areas, it's about water softeners, especially in the Midwest, because they have such hard water and you use salt as part of the softening process. But this is a map, and I toss this in here. First of all, reemphasizes 24 million tons of salt a year, emphasizes the salt belt up here in the north, in the northeast, in the mid-Atlantic. But also all this gray area in the west, they're using a mix of sand and salt. The only place that's really salt-free tends to be in the south. And so we're seeing increases in salt in streams, in lakes, in rivers, in wetlands, in groundwater. It's showing up everywhere. And the last thing I'll note is this map was put together by a company that was paying attention to corrosion on tractor trailers. Drew mentioned this, and I'm going to use some local Chester County data to emphasize it, that the salt concentrations in the streams where it's elevated is always elevated. And this is especially true in our urban streams. These are some data that Patty Hay, who was a Westchester Master's student and also a Chester County Master Watershed Steward, collected. These are 5 tributaries draining from Westchester Borough. They were only picked because it was an opportunity. Westchester, the borough, is kind of on a hill, and there's 5 different tributaries draining away from them. This is a single sample. Late summer, again, just like Drew, this is September. So no storms anywhere near these. Notice the range of values from 0, this is conductivity, to 1600. This is much higher than the data Drew was showing you. And the chloride is topping out over 400 in this set of data, as opposed to what Drew was showing you, which were conductivities in the, maxing out more in the 400 to 500, and chlorides maxing out in the 100 to 150. This is just background groundwater, because all stream water at base flow is really groundwater coming to the surface. So it's Plum Run, it's Black Horse Run, Taylor Run, Goose Creek, which is a tributary to Chester. So all the first 4 are all tributaries to the Brandywine. The last one is to Chester Creek. For a reference point, the White Clay Creek at the Stroud Center, we average about 12. So it's not pristine. That's because of agricultural, but gives you an idea of the difference. 300 years of agriculture in the White Clay Creek upper watershed here has elevated our salt load from, say, 5 or 4 or 3 up to 10 to 15, averaging around 12. This is the chronic EPA standard. What they define that as is a 4-day exposure once per year, one time every 3 years. We're seeing that at 2 of these sites being surpassed every day in August, September, October. So we're well past what EPA considered a chronic toxic load in at least 2, if not more, of these streams. And that's a base flow. And like Drew said, this can also be very variable. This is down on the Brandywine in Delaware, just outside of the Concord Mall area. So downstream of 202, it's actually in First State National Park. We see much higher conductivities again than Drew measured. Instead of peaking at 5,000, these sites around Westchester, Plum Run around Westchester, as well as Rocky Run, peaks out in the 40,000 to 50,000. This is a 4-day running average, peaking out at 25,000. Seawater is at 55,000. So both of these streams have approached seawater at least once in the last 3 years. So what does it mean? So we've run some tests for Pennsylvania DEP and for DRBC, Delaware River Basin Commission. There's toxicity tests, and I'm going to report to you what we refer to as a LC50, the lethal concentration that kills 50% of these bugs that we're working with. And that's what we're working with, our mayflies. So this is a dose response curve where at a low dose, everybody survives. And as you increase the dose, eventually you start killing insects. And the LC50 is that concentration, in this case, this illustration, just under 4,000, where 50% of your individuals die. It's a simple way of reporting toxicity, and it's a way of comparing across toxins as well as across taxa. We've looked at, asked the question, does the age of the animal matter? Does the duration of the exposure matter? Does stream type matter? Hard versus soft? Does the species involved matter? And finally, does water temperature matter? Fact is, all of them matter. In every test we ran, younger mattered, duration mattered. But the 3 most important were how long the test ran, what type of stream water, hard versus soft, and what was the water temperature. So let's walk through those 3. Duration of exposure, we ran 2 tests. One is a 2-day test, so like a spike. And then the other one was a 30-day test, which would be closer to your base flow. And what we found is the longer the exposure, the more toxic the chloride. So the LC50, when we went to the longer exposure, was 1/4 of what you would find for an acute test. So if the longer the exposure, the less salt they will tolerate. Toxicity increases as exposure increases. Hardness varies greatly, both within Pennsylvania and across the United States. Our hardest water is in the montane and middle America. Our softest water tends to be, for example, in the coastal plain and Piedmont of the eastern portions of the United States. That includes Pennsylvania. What doesn't show up in this area, being in the Ridge and Valley, is these little limestone streams, which can be very hard in and amongst a bunch of watersheds that are not very hard. We found that hardness made a big difference. We sampled water that went from White Clay Creek, which would be considered moderately hard, to Dyeberry, which is in the upper Delaware, to Spruce, which is in the upper Susquehanna, which would be considered quite soft. The harder the water, the more salt they could tolerate. That was the bottom line. So in this case, there was an advantage to be in a hard water system. But remember, for most of Pennsylvania, most of the mid-Atlantic, relative to the Midwest, all of our streams tend to be soft to moderately hard. Finally, temperature. You know, salt is out there year-round. So what's the difference between winter versus summer? So we ran tests comparing the toxicity at warm summer temperatures, which were going to be in the 20 to 25 degrees C. And that's just what you would see in streams around here in July, August. And then we did our best to get to winter temperatures. We took it down to 5, just above freezing. It's very hard to drive it lower than that because you start getting icing in the lab apparatus, and that blows everything up. Bottom line is, as you warm it up, the toxicity increases. That's to be expected, but we needed to demonstrate. The good news on that, it means that to some degrees, those higher winter concentrations may be less toxic than actually the warm weather concentrations that we observe in July, August, September. That's going to come into play eventually. It hasn't yet, but my suspicion is there's going to be winter criteria and summer criteria, and the reason why is average lab temperatures for toxicity testing are 20 degrees. That's just standard, 20 or 25. But this is again the conductivity graph for the Upper Rocky Run down in Delaware. If we use that criteria, there were 21 days in this little period here in 2017 that would have violated that criterion. If we use a winter criterion, then there's only 2. That's a big difference. 10 times as many days violating a 4-day running average. And so as a regulator, they're going to do their best to be applicable, and temperatures might be one that they're going to try to incorporate. To my knowledge, no state has done it. This is very new science. So in the end, what our studies told us is the duration exposure matters a lot. The stream type, water hardness matters a lot, and water temperature matters a lot. The one test we didn't run was comparing the different kinds of salts that are used as de-icing salts. Everything we did was with sodium chloride. So these are some data that EPA has paid for by various people. And these studies actually date all the way back into the 70s. They started doing work like this. What they've found, and these data illustrated, is of all the salts we use, sodium chloride is probably the most benign, whereas magnesium chloride is the most toxic. And the more they do this work, the more I'm convinced that the conversation right now and all my data is translated to chlorides. But it's actually the thing that matters is probably going to be whether it was sodium, magnesium, or calcium chloride when it was applied. But so these are LC50s, and you notice the lowest values in all 3. So Ceratophrys and Daphne are standard lab animals, zooplankton, and this is a fathead minnow, so it's a fish. This was the most toxic of the salts that we looked at. So why is it increased? Drew posed this, and here's my hypothesis. It's impossible to find any explanation on why we're applying double or triple or quadruple the amount of salt that was applied in the 70s when I was a kid, or when my parents were adults and making these choices. It seems as though road safety, economics, expectations, the public expectations, and politics all come into bear in these increases. One of the important factors I think that resulted in that mid-90s spike was a couple of studies that looked at road safety and suggested that salting reduced accidents. It's a very limited study in both cases, and one of the things that doesn't get corrected for is whether travel velocities increased and whether that you actually end up over the long term with equal number of accidents. They just change the driving behavior. But these studies show that once they started salting, accidents in the hours after salting went down. There's an economic argument. The quote I pulled, salt applications pay for themselves within an hour. Winter storms, you're late for work, you may miss work, slower travel, transportation is impaired, reduced productivity because people are not at work, schools closed, people need to stay home. There's an estimate floating around that a single winter storm results in, on average, $2.9 billion in costs associated with the storm. So by doing a little magic of chemistry, we can save the economy a lot of money. That's the argument. The third thing, expectations for clear roads and politics are linked. This is especially true for those of you who remember the 1990s around here, where the fate of many politicians was determined by how they responded to some big storms in the 90s. So originally, when I grew up, we talked about roads being passable. Was it passable? Versus now an expectation for the road to be clear. And the complaints are registered with the municipalities or with the state when the roads are not clear, not just a matter of passable, but clear. Then there became expectations and loss of convenience when it wasn't perfectly clear, and that went to the voting box. In other words, politicians paid a price if they didn't have the roads looking clear as could be in the middle of the worst storm of the year. As all that was happening, though, we've seen a slow increase in the negative impacts, the concerns around increased salt in our waterways. There's been conversations about taste and health, conversations about infrastructure costs, and conversations about aquatic toxicities. At this point, it's well enough known that this whole pattern is now referred to as the freshwater salinization syndrome. This is not a Pennsylvania issue. It's not a Christina Basin issue. This is a worldwide issue, and it's especially important in areas where road salts have been used at this point intensively for 50 or more years. So let's walk through it. Drinking water, one of the concerns is lead. That's what PB is. Most people don't realize that much of the conversation about lead in the Flint River, in the Flint water plant drinking water issue was tied to switching to a water source that had elevated salts due to road salt use. There's concerns about sodium. I put up here a study that was done in New York. They sampled almost 1,000 wells, and this is just a heat map where green is low sodium concentrations and orange, yellow, white, orange, red, and white end up being high concentrations. 50% of these wells exceeded the low sodium criteria for drinking water. The low sodium, if you were on a restricted sodium diet, 50% of these wells had greater than 20 milligrams per liter sodium. 10% exceeded the drinking water case standard of 250 milligrams per liter chloride. 10% of the wells. So it's suddenly this groundwater contamination becomes a drinking water contamination problem. Infrastructure and damage is really something that I thought we had forgotten about. I grew up watching cars rust away, and we seem to have solved it. But now it's back. It's obvious, and it's costing us billions. It's true for public property as well as private property. And if you haven't noticed it, next time you're walking through the parking lot, take a look at cars that are now showing salt damage, rust around their wheel wells, something that was really prominent in the 70s, but not so much in the decades after. I found two estimates of the cost. One is from Montreal. This is this gray slide here, and the other is out of New York. A couple of take homes. These are both busy. For the Montreal study, they estimated that if you're spending $100 per ton of road salt, your infrastructure costs are going to be $600. Your vehicular damage are going to be over $100. So $100 of road salt is buying $700 in infrastructure and property damage. The New York study looked at it slightly differently. They included ecological impacts, but it was really relatively insignificant compared to infrastructure and vehicles. Bottom line for them, they estimated that road salt use up there was costing about $25,000 per lane mile per year. It's something we haven't talked about, but people who are tracking this, whether it's road engineers or people chasing the money, are starting to pay attention and moving aggressively to try to control this. So how do we do it? It really, the conversation can't be safety and economy versus streams and infrastructure and drinking water. It can't be either or. It really needs to be all at once. The answer to this question, the parts of this puzzle, are going to have to be balancing all of these concerns. What's that mean around here? Well, I did a quick back of the envelope estimate for what it means for Pennsylvania. My best guess is PennDOT is applying about 150 pounds per person per year. Municipalities based on work in the Midwest are probably equaling that. So another 150 pounds per person per year. Private applicators, this would be homeowners, but probably more than that. This would be private parking lots, private roads, are probably applying about 100 pounds per year. Based on these estimates, that's about 400 pounds per person per year. That was back of the envelope. I later found that the state of Michigan estimated that for Michigan, that's the number they estimate per person per year for Michigan. So that's a ballpark figure. It's not a bad one in terms of guessing. But if you figure per household, there's 3 people in a household, you're suddenly up to 1,200 pounds per person per year. And if you take 2 households, 6 people, then you're almost at 1 pallet, 48 bags of 50-pound salt per 2 households per year. Think about a truck pulling up in every other house, putting a pallet of salt down and saying, this is your allocation for the year. That's what we're doing. So if you're wondering about why we have a problem, think about it in those terms. Well, most of that ends up in the waterway. So I took the conductivity meter at the USGS that Drew was talking about. That's right by the Brandywine River Museum. So these are data for the Brandywine. And I took their chloride concentrations and I just multiplied them together. This doesn't include a bunch of winter storms or anything. And it suggests to me that there's 37,000 tons of sodium chloride, salt, flowing by the Brandywine River Museum in the Brandywine every year. That's 80 pallets of salt per day. And that's not one of our bad sites. That's just what's going on. But remember, at 400 pounds per person, that's per year, that kind of makes sense. So how do we reduce it? The suggestions that are out there come from a variety of people, but basically I translate them. We're going to need more muscle and more machines. We're going to need to be calibrated in our chats. We're going to have to rely on friction and traction more than salt, more than chemistry. And we're going to have to address what's reasonable expectations for travel during winter storms. And the last one is one that's probably outside of our wheelhouse, but at a certain point, I think the whole process is going to benefit from a certification program. So let's walk through, what do I mean by more muscle and machines? It's about shoveling and blowing and removing the snow physically, both for the homeowner as well as for the municipalities or the landowner. The other thing that goes along with this is the use of brines. Believe it or not, Maryland has cut Maryland DOT has cut their salt use in half. And one of the ways is by aggressively brining. They actually apply brine behind the plow versus applying road salt. And the reason why is brine goes right to the surface and doesn't get removed the next time the plow goes by. 50% reduction. Thank you, Scott Ensign, for linking me to that data point this morning. The other thing is about calibrated. You know, people want to see the salt, and we're applying way more than is recommended. This is an illustration out of Toronto, where this is the recommended salt application, 20 grams per square meter. This is the typical parking lot application, which is 7 times greater. We're applying a lot more salt than the maintenance people, the maintenance science would say we need to do. And it gets calibrated by temperature, the type of precipitation, and the type of traffic that's going to be occurring. There's a lot of recommendations out there. And the challenge for the municipality is even having the ability to calibrate their application rates. But that's the only way we're going to control it. And that's true for parking lot maintenance too. Friction and traction, snow tires and anti-skid aggregates, in other words, sanding. I did a presentation a few years ago to the conservation districts of Pennsylvania. So 150 people in the room, asked them how many of them had bought snow tires, and a fraction of them had raised their hand. Then I asked them, how many of you bought snow tires in the last 5 years? Not one. Nobody is buying the tires. They're expecting the road to be clear enough that they don't need snow tires. But it's also about expectations. I grew up out in the West, in the mountains of Colorado, where you had chain laws and you had storm speed limits that were significantly less. The idea that there's an expectation that you can travel at 50 or 60 or 70 miles an hour and you will complain if you can't in the middle of a blizzard is just a false expectation. The road cannot be a runway or a speedway in the winter. And the law needs to help reinforce that, slowing down, having that expectation that people are going to travel slower. It's safer. And it also means that our expectations on road maintenance are different. Finally, certification programs. New Hampshire has one, Minnesota has one, Madison, Wisconsin has one. These can go a long ways to helping the municipalities, helping the private landowners do the right thing. There can be trainings, but it's different when it's certified. It's different when there's liability insurances tied to it, things like that. So points to remember, we have a salt problem. It's new. It's not something we knew about in the 70s. It's not that salt is a problem everywhere. It's increasing everywhere. But most streams right now are not at a problem level. However, we are seeing some sites where it's clearly lethal concentrations are present already. That depends though on the type of stream, the duration of the exposure, water temperature, but the laboratory data and the field data together say we've got salt impairments that right now are unrecognized. Fourth thing, the increase in salt represents the best of intentions, safety and economy. And it was asked for and paid for by us. So there's no one to blame, but we created another problem in the process. Now the negative impacts of increased salt use, they're not going to be easily resolved. And the reason why is we're addicted to road salt and what road salt allows us to do in the winter. And until we change those expectations, it's going to be very challenging to reduce our salt load. But that being said, there are examples out of New York, out of Colorado, now out of Maryland, where road salts have been significantly reduced, 30 to 50%, without any loss, to my knowledge at least, significant decline in winter travel conditions, just much better, much more judicious use of salt. So that's all I have, Drew.
That's really great, John. Thank you, both Drew and John. John, it was a good segue there that you sort of ended on, what can we do about it? What are the behavioral costs? So I'd like to open up the floor for questions first, and then, you know, some discussion of what municipalities are seeing. Are you addressing this issue? Is this on your radar? What do you, where does it fall in your realm? So anybody who wants to unmute themselves or use the chat, that would like to hear from you. Andrew Holmesy, go ahead.
Just a quick question for John. You had mentioned that the toxicity LC54 magnesium and calcium chloride are higher, but is it, I mean, I've always heard that those were better because I guess, need for, you know, the amount needed was less. And I know that some areas have recommended those. Is that not the case, or is it really depend on properly applying the right amount?
My conversations have been, people use magnesium chloride because it works at a colder temperature, but it's well known to be more corrosive and more toxic, but nobody told anyone that. They just said this works better when you've got ultra cold temperatures and you've got ice on the road. So there's a disconnect. Most people doing these applications haven't had the conversation about the environmental impacts or the corrosion. I talked to the Turnpike people about their use of magnesium chloride and brining, and they told me they stopped. They said the magnesium chloride brines were destroying their trucks. It's so corrosive. So there's a lot of mixed messaging out there. Magnesium chloride does work better at colder temperatures. There's no doubt about that. The toxicity data haven't been part of that conversation. The calcium chloride is quite often sold as a PetSmart, and that is true. It's not going to burn the paws of your dogs walking on the sidewalks. And so, but most homeowner applications are probably less than 2% of the load that goes into a watershed. It's really a small fraction. And if you applied roads, you know what they recommend for rock salt, sodium chloride, on a sidewalk or driveway is 1 cup, 12 ounces, 8 to 12 ounces of road salt for a 20-foot driveway. It's next to nothing compared to what you see. So if you think about exposure of your pets, it's going to be far less than the layer of salt that quite often homeowners apply because more looks better.
Thanks, John. Anyone from the municipality perspective of what you're seeing at your municipality? Is this an issue? Are you working to address these? Or is it just simply maybe not on the radar yet? Anybody? Sounds like I'm going to take the silence of maybe it's not on the radar just yet. Maybe something that's starting to look at. I know there's a lot of engineers, township engineers on the call. Is this coming up in your world? Is it especially, I'm guessing, maybe on the corrosion issues, on the issues of infrastructure or equipment impacts? Anybody have a question for our speakers? I'm curious, I'm gonna, Drew, you pointed out this 2012, 13 spike. John, you said in the Wisconsin, it seemed to be earlier. Does anybody see a reason why that might be happening? Other than, I think, John, you said expectations changed during that time period, perhaps?
My theory for the first bounce in the 90s what had to do with the safety studies that came out. But the truth is I can find nothing. And one of our tragedies, again, I don't think anybody did anything wrong here. They're trying to make the best choices possible. And the data came in that said that you can save economic loss and you can have fewer accidents if you salt more. So salting was a good answer. And you noticed how variable the data became, and that meant they were adjusting winter applications depending on severity. So they started calibrating, they just started applying more. The bounce up that Drew described, it also shows up, instead of being at 15 to 18 million metric tons a year, the US is at 22 to 24. Again, nobody has explained what has happened there. And that's a disconnect between people measuring things versus people applying things. And unfortunately, many of the people who made the decisions in the 70s and 80s and 90s have all retired. There's no written record or conversation. That was 30, 40 years ago when those discussions occurred. So the places that you see, Upper Midwest, New York, Maryland is all over this. It's happening, and what people have to understand is nothing is going to go down. It'll only get worse unless we reduce the salt load. That's just a given. There's no way that the salt suddenly becomes friendly. We're going to have to reduce the loads. I mean, if I'm measuring seawater at 2 locations around the Brandywine Valley, and I didn't pick those on purpose, then it's occurring in multiple locations, and will continue to until we reduce the load. And I think that the Turnpike Commission, the state agencies are very aware of the pressures, but they're also very, very conscious of their costs. And that's where I see the conversation starting. That's where I heard the most out of Maryland. That's where I heard the most out of the Turnpike Commission. The question that came to me was, do you have any idea is there any paint out there that can withstand this salt load? And they tried everything. And the bridge is basically rusting right out from under them. They cannot keep it painted to protect from the metal to the salt load. If you talk to your local auto repair guys, they'll tell you they see corrosion that they haven't seen. They're doing underbody repairs and mechanical repairs that are corrosion related that didn't occur 20 years ago. So people are talking about it.
So related to that, there's a question in the chat. I grew up in the Cleveland area and lived in the snow belt, by the way. And yeah, our cars rusted out all the time. And it is interesting. I was in Cleveland, Pittsburgh area over the holiday, and we drove through the snow. And I was surprised how my car did not have that white film all over it the next day. And I wonder if that's from more brine use there. We were on the turnpike between Ohio and Pittsburgh. So the question from Kathy Miller is brine spraying after plowing something a township can do easily enough? I don't know, Kathy, are you asking if they have the ability to do it, if they have the machinery to do it, or if it's an effective method? Is anybody on the call able to address that? I
talked to the Maryland guy because I found it fascinating when he shared that down at the Salt Conundrum 2 years ago in Delaware. And it was all new. And I don't know that it has been transferred to other states, but the logic was sound. If you're dumping rock salt behind your plow, then the next time the plow comes through, it pushes all of that salt away. Whereas the brine cuts straight through the snow and ice, goes right to the surface and stays. So the plow comes through the next time and a lot of your salt remains because it's spread out. And that's the other thing is the rock salt isn't spread out until it dissolves. So they felt that brining, even during the storm, was far more effective than rock salt was. Most people brine now to prevent snow and ice adhering tightly to the asphalt, so it makes plowing more efficient. These guys are saying that, so it's a pre-treatment. We call it an anti-icing treatment. This is a during the storm and post-storm treatment also. And that's how I interpreted what Maryland was recommending. And I'm just hoping that more of that information comes out and is transferable to the other states. The states lead the way. The states do the winter training, and the municipalities are given free access to whatever their recommendations are.
See, Dennis O'Neill wrote a comment, which, Dennis, this was in the back of my mind. It's generally not been on the radar because we're concentrating on sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus, which was sort of what I was thinking as there was sort of the silence in the room. You've been asked as municipalities to deal with that and not asked to deal with salt, although it says that a couple years some have inquired. Is there a possibility that salt will be regulated in some way? Salt use, salt methodology, as these numbers start to increase. I don't know, Drew, if you hear that in your circles, or, you know, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to bring this topic up, is to sort of get ahead of it before it comes to that.
Brian, I think because of a lot of the safety concerns, that regulations are going to be very slow to come. And to be honest, probably at the beginning, very ineffective. So I wouldn't see regulations affecting this in the short term, hopefully the long term. But as I think municipalities and the state realize it's as a safety issue, there's going to be a lot of political pushback against anything that would reduce safety on the roads. So I think that's going to be a tough political rock to push up a hill to get changes like that. But I think they're needed, but I wouldn't wait on them.
There are salt impairments in Maryland at this point, all around Washington, D.C. There are salt TMDLs throughout the snow belt in the upper Midwest at this point. The EPA criteria are from 1988. They're out of date. EPA has been revisiting. They came up with an approach. As soon as they came up with an approach, they discovered that the lab bioassays were creating criteria that probably weren't protective to field taxa, to field species. So they pulled back. I expect you will see some form of salt criteria coming forward. They've been working on it for a long time, and it's very challenging. And it's just like every other new criteria, there's gonna be a complicated conversation, because we generally lose the things we like the most. There was nobody happy when DDT disappeared, but it needed to happen. Mm-hmm. And they found different ways of solving the problem. So my guess is the infrastructure and drinking water problems in New Jersey, it's a big issue because of the sandy substrates. If your drinking water goes bad, your well gets contaminated, how do you sell your house? If that's the source of drinking water for you. or if you're a water provider. So one of the websites I looked at this morning, it was water providers that were asking homeowners and municipalities to reduce the salt load because their the water they're being able to provide out of their streams were getting close to the low sodium criteria. So that means that people couldn't drink their house water because if they were on a low sodium diet. It's the issues are happening around us. It's just we're not hearing about it.
That was a concern, John, that was brought up by a number of water providers in the county when we met with them last year. Basically saying that, you know, their source water, even their groundwater, but especially their intakes, especially more in the eastern portion of the county or in Delaware County, that the chloride levels are so high that they are worried about precipitating out some heavy metals, or they have already seen, you know, some higher lead concentrations or other heavy metal concentrations being brought out of the pipes because, or being brought out of you know, the soil conditions because of the high salt levels. So definitely an issue we've seen in Chester County.
I think we have time for one more question from Shane, and then Cory, if you want to queue up your shared screen. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of have more questions than one now since the conversation has been going on. But I guess this is a question for John and Drew. Like, what's the life cycle of chloride in the groundwater and in source water? My understanding is that it doesn't really go away. Like, is there a life cycle? Will it eventually go down if we decrease use, or are we kind of stuck with what we're at now?
No, if we reduce it, will go down.
Okay.
It'll reach an equilibrium somewhere at some point, depending on the load. It's not biologically active. It's not like nitrogen or phosphorus. It doesn't stick the way phosphorus does to sediments. So the water you're looking at in October or November could be 5 years old. It could be 10 years old. It could be 25 years old coming out of the groundwater. And it will take that long. If we were to stop all salt applications, it would take us decades to flush it all out because the groundwater at this point is contaminated. And it's just a matter of degree.
Okay. And then, like, this just got, I mean, I'm always thinking about plants, but, you know, there's also an impact to some of these BMPs that we're putting into the ground with the plants. I'm just throwing this out there to everyone because obviously plants don't really like salt either. Not a lot of the plants that we grow around here, especially. So, you know, think about your BMPs when you're applying salt to your parking lots and roads, because if it all goes there, you're going to have a lot of plant death as well. And then last comment, and this goes to what Cory was saying with the water providers, it seems like that might be the way to get the regulators to look. I mean, if it's really affecting drinking water and they can't provide it to the population, the general population, it seems like that's when regulators and, you know, people applying salt would get more on board. I don't know.
I think you're right, Shane, that if billions are needed to upgrade water plants to treat, and if billions are needed to fix roads, that's going to get more attention than anything else. It's going to. One other thing I want to comment on what you said too is all the BMPs. We've built a lot of detention ponds, and water that in the past might have run off into the stream and out to the ocean quickly is now being retained, which is good for a lot of things, but the salt is also being retained. And when that salty water goes into a retention basin and the water evaporates, the salt stays behind.
Yeah. So
it's there all year and it's slowly working its way into the groundwater. And to follow up what John said, we usually use somewhere, depending on the setting, between 10 years and 50 years before the groundwater system will clear itself. So it will clear itself, but not in a year or two.
thank you.
One thing, Shane, on your green stormwater infrastructure, if you've ever heard Rob Traeger talk about their history at Villanova and their stormwater demonstrations, one of his claims to fame about the success of their work was they inadvertently put very salt tolerant plants in their stormwater demonstration plants. And as a result, they didn't get the plant die off, but they generated data sets that show, 1,000 milligrams per liter chloride and things like that coming off these parking lots that normally would have killed everything. And it was just a lucky choice that they ended up with salt tolerant plants. It is, you can see the burn at the end of every winter where the salt spray is burned grass, burned trees, burned shrubbery, depending on how the spray leaves the roadway. It's quite obvious. And the soils are being impacted. It changes soil chemistry, primarily a sodium calcium trade-off. But there is some soil interactions that are changing also. And the other thing is they now know that the salt is mobilizing other runoff pollutants, other things coming off the parking lots and driving that into the groundwater far deeper than was originally imagined. There was a question about beets and beet juice. Two things that you need to be aware of. Most people use the beet juice not as a de-icer, but rather as a sticky. So the idea is that the rock salt doesn't bounce because the beet juice makes them sticky. The other thing is many of your beet juice products are actually very salty products. So beach heat or something like that is really a salt. And in many cases, it's a magnesium chloride. Your hot shots are the same thing. They take rock salt and then they coat it with magnesium chloride to burn through the ice before it gets down to the roadway. So these products that are out there are more complicated than maybe you imagine when you look at their name. You have to look at the ingredients.
Thank you, John. I'm gonna wrap up so we can get on with the next topic on the agenda, but I think we have something here for future consideration, and I am seeing in the chat some interest in perhaps some best management, best practices training for what we know now, and maybe to start sharing among municipalities what we can do now, which seems like a good place to start. So we'll consider that at CWMP for a potential future workshop or activity. I'm going to turn it over now to Cory Trego, who's been working really hard on a model ordinance and has a draft. So Cory, go ahead and take it away. Thanks again, both Drew and John, for your excellent presentations.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, so I have a brief presentation. I'm going to focus mostly on kind of our public review period for our model ordinance, but I will go through some of the changes and just highlight some of the provisions of the updated model ordinance. But we do have this posted for public review until January 7th. So I just wanted to let people know where to find that. So like I said, we'll do a little bit on the public review period, cover the proposed provisions and some of the proposed changes, and then we'll take any questions. So as many of you are probably aware, this effort started back in 2019. I think I even saw one of Jan's old presentations before I had gotten here from the Stormwater Summit in 2018 that she had mentioned that we were planning to update this ordinance. But in 2019, we kind of began our public input process in earnest with a number of public meetings that fall, stakeholder meetings throughout the winter of 2019 and 2020, and then resuming again this past year. Well, I guess resuming really through the fall of 2020 into the winter of 2021. And so we took all that information that we got through our 24 public meetings. We updated the model ordinance as best as we could to incorporate much of that public input, and then also incorporated the required changes to be consistent with PADEP's 2022 model ordinance that all MS4 municipalities across the Commonwealth are required to be consistent with by September 30th of 2022. And so we wrapped all that up earlier this fall, and we presented kind of an initial draft of the finalized ordinance at a public meeting on September 21st. We had about 80 something attendees at that meeting. Most people attended virtually. We had a number of good comments during and then after that meeting. We made a few minor tweaks to the ordinance and then presented a kind of finalized draft version on November 5th. And again, I think we had 60 something attendees to that meeting. After that meeting, we had a couple-week period where we had asked people to review the draft documents, give us any additional feedback that they did not give us at the meeting. And we did get a number of comments from people, and we made a number of small changes based off of those comments. And so then on November 23rd, we opened up our official 45-day public review period running through January 7th. So the document is posted for review on CCWRA's website. We sent this out to, I think, over 300 email addresses. So it went out to all the municipalities. Many municipalities have provided us with contact information for additional people, either supervisors or planning commission members or their engineer, to be as a point of contact for this update process. So we included them, sent it to surrounding municipalities, school districts, and other interested individuals, to try to get it out to as many people as possible. But like I said, we posted this on our website. I think it was November 22nd, and the review period started on November 23rd. So if you go to chesco.org/water, the website will look like this. And one of the first things you'll see on that website is this note about the updated draft ordinance and the links available to view those documents. We tried to make it as easy as possible to follow along with the changes. So any text that was added to the document, we highlighted in a green, like a neon green color. Any text that we removed, we highlighted in red, and we have a strike through that text. So it's relatively easy to kind of scroll through the document and see where changes were made. We also have a summary of changes table up on our website as well. I think there's 51 or 52 changes that we made. Many of them were very minor, just kind of tweaking language a little bit. But if you don't feel like scrolling through a 100+ page model ordinance, you can go through this document, and all the changes are summarized fairly succinctly here. So just real quick, highlighting some of those changes that we made and just highlighting the minimum standards. So we tweaked this a little bit, but we had originally had basically a requirement that there could be no change in stormwater runoff, peak rate discharge, or total runoff volume to down gradient properties. In the past couple of weeks, so I guess it was after our November 5th meeting, we did have some people reach out to us who expressed concern that as the language that we had modified, if we have an IDA type event and there's discharge from a 500-year storm event, in theory, people would be able to lodge complaints against their neighbors if they're getting runoff from like a 500-year storm event, when we really only require the 100-year event, the peak rate control for the 100-year event to be managed. So we did tweak this a little bit, saying that peak rate discharges up to 100-year storm, or the volume of runoff up to the 2-year storm can't be modified unless you get permission from your down gradient property owner. Water quality and volume control. So we kept these mostly the same. We did just add an option. So it's either the no net increase in runoff for the 2-year storm event, or up to 1.5 inches of runoff from regulated impervious surfaces, just to be consistent with DEP requirements. Infiltration, we had originally required a minimum infiltration of 1.5 inches unless there was some kind of geotechnical reason or subsurface contamination issue where you could not facilitate 1.5 inches of runoff. So we had wanted this to be consistent with infiltrating the full water quality and volume amount. We still have that language in there stating that that is our preference, but now we have a minimum of 1 inch of infiltration that we're requiring, unless you have either karst geology beneath you or subsurface soil contamination that would prevent infiltration, or some other kind of significant site limitation. We didn't really modify the stream channel protection requirements. They remain the same. So it's reducing the 2-year post peak rate runoff to the 1-year pre, and attenuating the 1-year 24-hour runoff volume. And then we also kept these peak rate controls the same as well. So 10-year post runoff we have an option to reduce that to the 2-year pre, same for the 5-year post runoff down to the 2-year pre-development runoff. And then for the 25, 50, and 100-year post, we just have that required to be reduced to the 100-year pre. So you're not increasing the volume of the peak rate volume of runoff for the 25, 50, and the 100-year events. We added some language for permanent protection and O&M requirements. So they are O&M plans are required to be recorded with the Chester County Recorder of Deeds. And then we did modify the long-term O&M requirements and inspection requirements to be consistent with DEP. So it does require a little bit more frequent inspections, but I think that will help ultimately make sure that these systems continue to function properly. And then we have a number of provisions for relaxed controls. We kept some exemptions for ag-related activities. Residences that are being reconstructed within their footprint, their original footprint, are exempt. Road improvements for municipalities, maintaining existing driveways, those are all exempt from this. And then we also still kept in a simplified approach, and I'll touch on that in a minute here. We modified that a little bit to make it easier to implement and hopefully more cost effective. And then we also kept this provision for ag structures. So if a structure is included in a conservation plan or a mushroom farm operation plan, there's an option for a municipality to have an exemption up to 10,000 square feet of a building area and 5,000 square feet of vehicle movement area. Like I said, as long as that is a part of a conservation plan or a mushroom operation plan. And then we allowed an option for municipalities to reduce the peak rate control standards. So rather than taking the 10-year post-development, the 5-year post-development, and reducing that to the 2-year pre-development peak rate, you can just keep the 5-year post and the 5-year pre the same, 10-year post and 10-year pre the same as well. So you're just not increasing peak rate with a development project. We have a lot more of an emphasis on conservation design, low impact development, and using green infrastructure. And we ended up updating, basically completely revamping Appendix B to focus on conservation design, low impact development, and green infrastructure site design process. So we're, really coming to acknowledge that, stormwater BMPs only go so far, but if you're not designing a site well, so if you're taking, naturalized swales, or you're removing large swaths of mature wooded vegetation, especially in natural drainage areas, so ephemeral streams or too close to riparian buffer areas, you're really having a very significant impact on the volume of runoff that's going to be making its way to local waterways. So we're trying to significantly encourage better site design, reducing the amount of impervious cover that's installed in a development, keeping as many woodlands as possible, leaving as many areas as naturalized meadow conditions as possible, and especially reducing grading in any kind of area that is a natural drainage pathway, so that you're not disrupting the hydrology of a site. So trying to reduce infiltration or reduce compaction, improve infiltration because of that reduction in compaction, and leaving as many natural areas natural as possible. That's going to have a pretty big impact on the amount of stormwater that is generated, and can save costs because you're not having to put in as many stormwater controls if you're reducing disturbed area. One of the biggest feedbacks that we heard throughout our whole process was that the current redevelopment standards may not be strict enough. Right now redevelopment you can do much lower amounts of stormwater runoff control than new development. But the reality is, existing development is where there's a lot of issues with stormwater runoff. And so we give the municipality the option to remove a current exemption that's in the ordinance that would exempt development from peak rate control runoff for redevelopment that reduces impervious surface by 20% or more. The goal was to try to encourage reduction in impervious surface. We just haven't seen a lot of that over the past 10 years or so, 8 years since the ordinance was implemented. So we are exempting this or giving municipalities the option to remove this exemption. And then we increased or gave municipalities the option to increase the percentage of existing impervious area that's classified as meadow in good condition from 20% to 40%. And so right now in the ordinance, in a redevelopment project, 20% of existing impervious cover needs to be classified as meadow in good condition for stormwater calculations. We are allowing municipalities to double that basically, so there can be more stormwater control. And then we did update the simplified approach, which is Appendix A, to have just one BMP type, an infiltration trench. It's a roof offset, so you're basically capturing roof drainage from a garage, a shed, or your home, and directing that to this infiltration trench. And then there's a sizing table that basically says, here's the size of your BMP, here's how large the trench needs to be, or the size of the area that you're capturing, so the amount of basically roof runoff that you're capturing. And we have an easy chart that says, okay, here's how large your trench needs to be, with a complete template for submission to try to make this as easy as possible. Yeah, so just trying to save some costs that way for smaller projects. And like I said, that's applicable for, we have that applicable for projects up to 2,000 square feet of impervious area, or I think 5,000 square feet of earth disturbance. Municipalities can choose how they want to modify that. They can make that more stringent, but they cannot make that less stringent. So I mentioned earlier, right now, these documents are posted on our website for public review. They'll be up until January 7th. Then we'll wrap up all the comments that we get, and we will update the ordinance as needed based on those comments. We're looking to have a public hearing in February of 2022. And then as soon as that public hearing wraps up, we'll send this to DEP for their final review. And we'll hope to get this out sometime next spring as a finalized copy of the ordinance, and will help municipalities through that rollout process of replacing the ordinance that they currently have with the updated version. So that is our timeline. Our goal is to have as many municipalities as we can update their ordinances by that September 30th of 2022 deadline. But we are working with DEP. They know we're updating our countywide ordinance. So municipalities are kind of waiting on us to get this out. So the quicker DEP reviews it, the easier it is for us to roll it out to municipalities. But we'll work with you guys throughout the whole process through September 2022 and beyond if needed. So I think I went a little over my time, but yeah, that's a quick overview of the updated countywide model stormwater management ordinance.
Any questions for Cory? Thank you for that update. I know we're just over our time here. I did reach out to DEP. They weren't able to attend the meeting. On the agenda, I did copy, I didn't want to interpret what Krista sent me, a brief update from her that there is a new engineer. I believe the previous engineer was Harris. Krista has moved on to a new position. They're working to fill her position. She's still available to answer some MS4 questions, and still through the NIPD's program will be involved in the MS4. It sounds like the answer to our question about the new permit cycle is they're talking to EPA, and stay tuned. So nothing really new there, other than I guess they're waiting to have a discussion there. And that the MS4 permits for PennDOT and the Turnpike Commission have been issued. She did send me copies of those. If you're on the Google discussion group, I sent out the fact sheet parts of those. But I do have those documents, or you could get those from Krista if you wanted to see those. So you could just email me. And as we close out the meeting, I know Cory had mentioned, as some of the Recovery Act funds are now sort of trickling down through states and counties, and a portion can be set aside for water infrastructure. We're anticipating there could be a future workshop with a meeting with potential county funds. But I know there's a lot of other meetings, webinars going on with different agencies discussing this. And so I did put a question in the chat. Is this something that municipalities are looking for assistance with? Feel like you're aware of what these funding sources are, what's available, what kind of projects might be eligible? It seems to me like maybe maybe early 2022, this might be an important topic. So any comments on the funding with municipalities and things you're looking at?
So
know that
I can
we're
give a little
5
bit of
minutes over.
information. I don't know exactly where we stand on this. I haven't heard an update in at least a couple of weeks. But Chester County will be getting about $102 million of American Rescue Plan Act funding. So a pretty substantial amount. And from my understanding, the county has put together a team that'll help basically review project applications for that money. So at some point, I think they were trying to get this out by the end of the year, and perhaps it is already posted, but the county was basically going to be accepting applications for projects. Not all the $102 million is going to go out to municipalities or to other groups for projects. Some of that money is to kind of recoup some losses and from direct COVID impacts. But there will be a substantial amount of funding available for various infrastructure projects. So the county has a group that they put together that I guess has been working on kind of project criteria, and they will review project applications. And I guess I think they're looking to, like I said, try to do that before the end of the year and then start making selections probably sometime early in 2022.
So we were hoping that if something did come available, there might be a relatively short notice meeting set up for CWMP that we would try to share whatever information we could get for you. So we're sort of waiting on that, right, Cory? And so just keep your eye out for a future email, but it'll be a relatively short notice just to get the information out to you as quick as possible. Any other
Brian?
questions or comments as we close out our meeting? I'd like to thank everybody for participating today.
Brian, there's two state bills that people should keep their eyes on. There is one bill that's been proposed that could impact these. State Bill 832 creates a clean stream fund, and that's $250 million from the American Rescue Plan. And there's State Bill 525, which would be $500 million to reinvigorate growing greener. Both of those have the ability to impact what, if they pass, how money's available to the municipalities.
Thanks, John. And I know the workshops I've been in, there's interest in, some of them are shorter term, addressing flooding and flooding concerns. There's an interest in reaching underserved communities. There's interest in infrastructure improvements. And there's funding, I think it was NRCS on the wildlife side. So there is funding going to all these agencies that is worth paying attention to and sort of being aware of what their priorities are. On the fish and wildlife side, we were talking just the other day about, your project might not have a fish and wildlife goal, but it may have that co-benefit that you might be able to apply for those funds. So there's a lot to pay attention to. We'll try and keep you try and keep those sending them to you via the methods we have with email or the website or future workshops. apologize for being over the time. Thanks everybody for our presenters, and thanks everyone for participating, and hope to see you at a future CWMP meeting or activity. Thanks everyone.